First, let me thank the Committee of 70, State Representative Jared Solomon, the League of Women Voters, and Northeast Times for sponsoring this conference on political reform of our electoral process. I'm Dr. Jessie Fields. I'm a physician, a political independent, a board member, and spokesperson for Open Primaries, which is a national organization advocating for opening up primaries. So I'd like to briefly share with you why I care very much about electoral reform, about increasing citizen participation in electoral reform campaigns, and in the essential right in a democracy, that is the right to vote. The current state of our politics in our country is one, I think we all would agree, of deep moral crisis, in which partisanship is eroding our democracy and dividing the American people. We are, let's acknowledge, I'm proud to be from Philadelphia, we are in Philadelphia, the birthplace of the nation, of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. This year, in fact, is the 150th anniversary of the passage of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. That 14th Amendment states that no state shall make or enforce any law which denies to any citizen the equal protection of the laws. I believe that the ideals of our nation can only gain concrete and full expression through an open and democratic political process. So I was born and grew up right here in Philadelphia, in South Philadelphia, in the old 7th Ward, in the midst of the underground sub-economy of poverty in the black community. I know something about feeling trapped at the bottom of the world with little hope. I became a doctor to help improve the conditions in which people live and to help others overcome those odds. I went to medical school and completed my residency here in Philadelphia at the Medical College of Pennsylvania. My own particular involvement in political reform started after my medical residency as a young physician practicing on the west side of Chicago and seeing how isolated and distant the community was from participating in the political processes that greatly affected people's lives in terms of housing, education, healthcare, economic opportunity, human growth and development, youth development, and so many issues. So voter participation at all levels is critical, as are competitive elections that allow for real choice and accountability. So the issue of open primaries is being debated around the country. Closed partisan primaries, such as exist here in Pennsylvania and in 11 other states, including New York, Florida, New Jersey, New Mexico, etc., exclude independent and non-affiliated voters and third-party members from primary voting. So there has been a change in people's affiliation over the last several decades, reaching a height currently. More and more people, given the partisanship, given the dysfunction, the gridlock, more and more people are becoming independents, are not affiliating with either the Democratic or the Republican Party. And closed partisan primaries allow only those registered in a political party to vote, and that voting is limited to only that party's candidates. So the principle behind open primaries is the principle that every voter has the equal right to full access to voting in every state of the elections without being required to join a political party in order to exercise the right to vote. That's the principle behind open primaries. So in Pennsylvania, there are over 1.5 million registered voters. They are unaffiliated, most of them are unaffiliated independent voters, some are third-party voters, and they do not have the right to vote. They're excluded from voting in primaries in the first round. There are states, besides Pennsylvania, 11 other states that have completely closed primaries in which independent, unaffiliated, and third-party voters are shut out. So overall, there are two types of open primaries, two types of, in general, ways of dealing with this issue of many voters being locked out of the process. There are what I call party-oriented open primaries in which independent voters, unaffiliated voters, are allowed to vote in the primary of the party that they choose. And then there are nonpartisan open primary elections in which all voters are allowed to vote together among all the candidates, and then the usual form is that the top 2 vote getters go on to the general election. So these are the 2 types of open primaries that allow voters who are not registered in a party to vote. And so I wanted to talk about the impact of open primaries in places where they exist. So that in terms of the open primary system where unaffiliated voters can vote in the party primary of their choice, Colorado is the example of that, which is recently enacted through voter initiative, an open primary system. And the other example of the nonpartisan open primary is in California and Washington, and also in Nebraska for state offices. So that's the system where everybody votes together, the top 2 vote getters go on to the general election. All of these forms of open primaries have, for the most part, been enacted by voter initiative. So I wanted to talk about the impact in terms of the open primaries in Colorado, the open primary model. This was passed in 2016. There was by voter initiative that was placed on the ballot by a coalition, and it granted 1.3 million Colorado voters registered as independents the right to participate in primary elections without having to give up their independent status. So some states require you have to join a party to vote in the primary. So in June of this year was the first open primary in Colorado under the new initiative. And 291,000 independent voters voted in the primary for the first time. 25% of the ballots cast were cast by independent voters, and voter turnout was the highest that it has been in Colorado in several years. So primary voting is important to increase voter turnout, to give people the right to vote. It's also important in terms of the primary. The primary is often the election in which it's often the election that determines the outcome. As the previous speaker was talking about the issue of gerrymandering, so when there's one-party districts, the primary is the election, because the person who wins the primary and is on that main party ballot wins the election. So they don't even have to campaign. This is the case in many, many states, and was the case in Colorado before they made this change. So the coalition, Let Colorado Vote, who worked to put this initiative on the ballot in 2016, that coalition continued. They didn't just stop because they won one reform. They kept working, and they supported redistricting, and they were able to win. The Colorado legislature has voted unanimously to put a redistricting reform on the ballot in November, this election, and that will be on the ballot. It's called Amendments Y and Z for redistricting for state and congressional elections. And so I think that's an important lesson, is that it doesn't just take one reform. We can put together a coalition and keep going and keep fighting for other reforms. And then in California, which has, the initiative was on the ballot in 2010 for top 2 nonpartisan open primaries. It was passed by the voters. And since the impact has been, since they passed this initiative and have been under the nonpartisan system, before they passed the initiative, from 2000 to 2010, only 5 California incumbents in the state legislature lost their seats in those 10 years, in that decade. In the first year alone of the top two election system, 10 incumbents lost their seats. California now has some of the most competitive elections in the country. 50% of California races on average are decided by 10 points or less, and incumbents no longer can just assume that they'll be in office for many, 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 many years. And more people are running for office. Voter turnout in the primaries is double the national average in California. And it has also helped to increase the diversity in the legislature. It's also helped the legislature in California to be able to work across party lines, to come together on complicated issues like economic growth, cap and trade, and gun regulation. Republican and Democratic lawmakers frequently develop and sponsor legislation together in California, and budgets are being passed on time, and voter confidence in the legislature increased from 14% to 42%. So I'm not trying to say that open primaries or nonpartisan elections are a panacea. They are not. They're a way of changing the structure, changing the context, and allowing for the possibility of people to come together and giving voters more options and more power in their vote. Also, the Legislative Black Caucus and the Legislative Latino Caucus in California has increased in size by 25% in the last 8 years. More people of color there are running for office. You can see that in the Senate. And win election, more people of color are winning elections than we're winning in the closed primary system. Okay, so these are the states that have nonpartisan voter registration and allow independent voters to vote by choosing which party they want to vote in. And as I said, in Pennsylvania, there are many, over 1.2 million unaffiliated voters. And interestingly, in Philadelphia, there's been a growth in the numbers. It's doubled in the numbers of independent voters has doubled over the last 10 years, and now there are more independents in Philadelphia than Republicans. So let me wrap up. I would like to end with a quote. I'd like to end with a quote from the orator, abolitionist, 19th century reformer, and American patriot, Frederick Douglass, from his last major address, Lessons of the Hour. He said, "Could I be heard by this great nation, I would call to mind the truths with which at its birth it saluted and started a listening world. It announced the advent of a nation based upon human brotherhood and the self-evident truths of liberty and equality. Apply these sublime and glorious truths to the situation now before us, now before you." Thank you.